Our time is brief, so I'll get straight down to business. I will deal with 6 points. I want to talk about why I wrote and why I named this book the way I did, the nature of and extent of frontier conflict, the recent reaffirmation of frontier conflict in new research, how and when it was forgotten, whether it was actually war, and if so, how do we deal with it? So let's begin with why I wrote this book. Now, for those of you who know some of my previous books, you probably think I'm repeating myself, like, there he is rattling on again about frontier conflict. And this is to some extent true. This book is a synthesis of quite a number of my previous books. But it is also encompasses a lot of new research that's been done in many parts of Australia. But even more to the point, in a way, it emerges in a new environment. That is, the times themselves have made the book newly relevant. Above all, the cavalcade of commemoration about war, which is already underway and will gain momentum over the next 12 months to 2 or 3 years. Well, then let's move on to the question of frontier conflict. What indeed can be said about it? Firstly, it was clearly abiding. It lasted from the first few weeks of settlement at Sydney Cove and was still apparent in the 1920s in the more remote parts of Australia. So it was abiding. It was also ubiquitous. That is, it happened in almost every district, in one way or another, for some time or another. It was therefore a constant accompaniment of Australian settlement. It was constantly there. So that for every year, for 140 years or so, there were people being killed out in the remote parts of Australia. And remoteness in a way moved as the frontier moved. What was remote in 1820 wasn't remote in 1920. And while most of those people who died were Aboriginal, there were also significant numbers of settlers who were killed in this conflict. Now, many of you will know that this whole question has been very contentious, and it was at the centre of what we know as the history wars. But the history wars, surprisingly, had the good result of stimulating a lot of people to either go back and look at their previous research or to do new research altogether. So the view of the frontier that I sketched out a long time ago, I think, has been reaffirmed by the new work in Tasmania, Queensland, Northern Territory and South Australia. The single most contentious thing that I think I made, the single most contentious point I made, was that in the other side of the frontier I suggested that it was reasonable to suppose that 20,000 Aboriginal people had been killed in frontier conflict. Now, it would seem now almost certainly too low a figure, and the work in Queensland suggests that that is probably even inadequate for Queensland alone. Well then, I've dealt with why I wrote the book, why it was called Forgotten War, which we'll come to. And as I say, but what do I mean by forgotten? Well, the interesting thing is that there was a wide awareness of frontier conflict in colonial Australia. People in colonial Australia who read newspapers or heard about debates in Parliament or were aware of speeches being made, or people who wrote letters, there is abundant evidence everywhere in the colonial record for the reality of frontier conflict. Make no mistake about it. But in 1970, if you confined yourself to historical works, you would wonder what had happened to this awareness, because there was a forgetting. Now, I became aware of this forgetting in quite direct ways, because I went to North Queensland in the late 1960s, a very young lecturer, and I was asked to lecture in Australian history. And I was provided with the textbook, which was the textbook of the most important man in my academic world, that is the Professor of History and Politics at the University of Queensland, of which we were a college. So this was handed down on high. Here is the book you shall use. It was indeed the best known and most widely used general history of Australia at the time. Now, in many ways it was a good book, but eventually, before the end of the year, I realised there was absolutely nothing about Aborigines in that book. Nothing. There wasn't even an entry in the index. They did not exist. Now, out of curiosity, I looked up all the reviews of the book that had been published a few years before. And many of the leading historians who weren't in this book, because it was a multi-authored book, many of the leading historians who weren't in the book actually reviewed it. And not one of them, not a single one of them, noticed the omission. Not one. Now, I may well not have realised there was something wrong had I not been living where I was, because you were aware every day of Aborigines and Islanders and the fraught relationships every day in the street you were aware. And even more important, my students were aware, because they by and large came from often very much smaller places than Townsville. They came from cattle stations, their parents worked as teachers on Aboriginal missions and reserves. They had grown up knowing that race relations were critically important. So I realised that there was something drastically wrong, and that is why I began doing this research. Not that I was encouraged. When the most important man in the profession, who edited the most important journal, said to me, "Well, now, young Reynolds, what are you going to do now? You're up there in North Queensland." And I said, I might do something about the Aborigines. He said, "Oh my God, there's not much in that, is there?" So this was the attitude that existed up to the late 1960s and into the 70s. That is, not only had the frontier conflict been forgotten, but the Aborigines themselves had been written out of the story. And with them out of the story, you could celebrate the fact that Australian history was uniquely peaceful. So, I've dealt then with the book, I've dealt with frontier conflict, and I've dealt indeed with the forgetting. But there is, however, the in some ways more important question of was it or not war. There was conflict, yes, almost everyone agrees with that. The new research has confirmed the conflict as being, as I said, ubiquitous and abiding. And in many ways, the silence about this was broken by the 1970s. But was the conflict war? Was it war at all? Well, now, I began my career working on this material, and in a way, I took my cue from many of those people in the colonial period who indeed described it as war. Now, these were not just ordinary settlers out there, frightened for their life about being speared. This was the view of most of the senior officials from the British government in the various colonies. They were almost all military officers. Most of them had, of course, served in the Napoleonic Wars, and particularly in the Peninsular War. They knew a guerrilla war when they saw one. And they almost universally talked about war. So in a way, it seemed quite natural to begin using their terminology. Not a terminology I imposed on it, but one which came out of the record itself. Well then, what do we do then about this conflict, if indeed it is war? It's unavoidable, it's inescapable, we can't avoid it. But in a way, I return to this subject because of the tremendous way in which we are now seeing war as being absolutely central to the Australian experience. As many of you will be aware, you simply can't avoid war at the moment. In books, in films, in programs, in tours of battlefields, in scholarships, it is absolutely inescapable. Well then, how do we deal with frontier conflict, if indeed it is war? How do we bring these two things together? Or put it another way, what makes conflict a war and not something else? Now, one of the new things I did, and which I hadn't done before, was do quite a bit of reading about war, the theories of war, going right back to the great Prussian theorist of war, von Clausewitz. And I came to agree that what makes a conflict a war is not just the tactics, it's not the numbers involved, it's not the weapons, it's not the heroism of soldiers, it's not particular battles, it's not the cleverness or the incompetence of commanders. It is the politics of the war. That is, it is the great strategic objectives that are being struggled for. That is what makes ordinary conflict, which might just be seen as criminal, into war. What was the war actually about? Now, this is where I think we have to totally reconsider our attitude to the war within Australia, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was a war that was fought in Australia. Almost every other war that Australia's been involved with has been fought somewhere else, often half a world away. Not only was the war in Australia, it was about Australia. It was about Australia. It was about the largest questions you can imagine. It was about, after all, the ownership and control of the most productive land in the country. It was also about the exercise of sovereignty over the whole continent, that is, law and politics. In other words, it seems to me inescapable that this was our great war. After all, what could be more important than the control and the ownership and the use of a whole continent? And it wasn't just an important war in terms of Australia, it was a war of global importance because it saw the transfer of the property and sovereignty over one of the world's continents. Now, it's for that reason that I think this has to be considered as a significant and most important war. Then we're faced with the question of what do we do when there is literally no recognition of this war in any of the commemorations that are now developing leading up to 2014. There is no public recognition of this conflict as war, either by the government, by the Department of Veteran Affairs, or by the Australian War Memorial. Now, one of the things I begin the book with is a remarkable letter written by a young man in Launceston in 1830, at the end of the Tasmanian Black War, in which he says, how should we regard these people? Because three Aboriginal men had been captured, they'd killed a most prominent settler, and people were demanding that revenge be taken. But he said, wait a moment, let's just remember that these people have got a legitimate complaint. They are fighting heroically for their own country. They are doing what we would be expected to do if we were in their position. They are patriots. They are patriots who we should admire. Well, now, I just wonder how long it will take before Australia in general can adopt that view which was expressed so long ago that it was war, that the Aborigines were defending their territory in most heroic ways, and they should be seen as patriots defending their homelands. Well, we shall wait and see about what will happen over the next few years as the cavalcade of war celebration marches on. Thank you very much.